The deed book was warm from another hand when the clerk slid it across to me. The ink bled slightly, where a pen had pressed too hard as if someone had leaned in with impatience. Denver in 1996 carried the dry brightness of late autumn, sun sharp as a tack head on the windows of the county clerk's office. Floor wax and old paper gave the room a hushed, bureaucratic sanctity, a place where families were embalmed in cursive and stamps. I'd come alone, because that was how we walked into rooms when pride outran good sense. The clerk's hair was pinned back with a barrette that caught the light, and her practiced politeness scattered like gravel under the soles of bad news. I paged carefully, the way a churchgoer handles hymnals, and watched our surnames step down the columns through the decades, fathers to sons, mothers to widows, until the trail reached a loop and then a knot. The signature near the knot was familiar in a way that made my mouth go dry. It had the same slant my brother learned by copying our father's letters at the kitchen table, the same impatient tail on the G, the flourished L like a banner. A paragraph later, a date no one had told me about, and a phrase that pulsed like an injury, contract pending. I said nothing to the clerk. I measured my breath. The air felt thinner, or perhaps I was older than the air. Halfway down the page, a folded map tucked into the binding rasped against my knuckles, pale blue lines crossing pale green like veins under skin. That was where a fresh survey line knifed through our north field as if it had always been there. The orchard, stunted survivors that still set fruit by habit, now lay on the wrong side of a future fence. I recalled counting rings on a fallen apple tree with my son when he was 10, the way sap smelled like sugar and iron, and how my brother had laughed at us for treating a stump like a reliquary. The clerk cleared her throat softly. "Do you need a copy, sir?" Her voice had the tone that said she had already made several that morning for people who could not afford what paper makes real. I nodded, and she fed the machine with the sleepy rhythm of someone who has learned to pace the grief of strangers. While the glass hummed, I watched the faint tremor in my own hand and understood it wasn't fear. It was the strain of an old bow bent one more time. I told myself it could be a misunderstanding, perhaps a preliminary inquiry, perhaps some developer fishing for weak fences. Then I saw the escrow receipt number typed neatly in the margin, the clerk's stamp from last week, and my brother's phone message summary pasted where my acknowledgement should have been. Not a formality, a maneuver. He knew I would check eventually, but not this soon. He always assumed proximity to silence meant consent. It had been his habit since we were boys. Take the slice with more frosting, pocket the coin father left on the mantel, for good luck. Tell me I had misunderstood when. I reached to claim my half. On the walk out, the building breathed its stale warmth at my back, while the hallway drafts tugged at the edges of my coat like small tugboats. The elevator took its time as if deciding which of us deserved gravity. I had the copies folded flat in my inside pocket, the weight of them pressing against my ribs like a second paper heart. My feet remembered other corridors, a hospital wing where mother's voice thinned to a thread, a school office where my son's principal spoke about fighting and indignation as if they were synonyms, a law office where my wife, long dead now, had placed her hand over mine without a word when a stranger read our will aloud and left no space for breath. Outside, the sky over Colfax shone a bright, indifferent blue. Buses coughed, pigeons rearranged themselves on the courthouse eaves, and somewhere a siren stitched a seam through the afternoon. I stood on the steps and felt the particular cruelty of seeing the mountains so clearly that you could mistake distance for safety. My brother's car would be in his driveway by now, nose pointed toward a horizon he believed was his to redraw. He had forgotten the years I spent learning which words cut and which words bind. I folded the copies again, unnecessarily, as if neat creases could keep history from fraying. The paper rustled like dry grass before lightning strikes. I thought of our father shaping fence posts from beetle-killed pine, tar under his nails, saying, "A claim is only as strong as the man who stands beside it when the weather turns." The weather had turned. My breath fogged once and then scattered. I stepped into the thin Denver light with one resolve. This time, the land would choose me over blood. The words stayed in my mouth like iron filings, gritty and metallic, refusing to dissolve. I kept walking down Colfax, each step measuring out a thought. The air was crisp enough to make the lungs notice their own work. My brother had probably finished his coffee by now, the kind he pretended to grind fresh but bought pre-packaged from a warehouse club. I pictured him leaning back in his kitchen chair, ankles crossed, satisfied with the neatness of his scheme. In the years since our father's funeral, we had spoken more through intermediaries than in person. Letters, not phone calls. Signatures, not conversations. It wasn't distance that did that. It was the slow erosion of trust, like wind hollowing stone until only the outer shape remained. That's why seeing his handwriting in the clerk's book wasn't just a legal matter. It was a ghost of every moment he had chosen himself over us. Halfway to the parking garage, I passed an old man selling apples from a cart. His coat was patched, his hands blackened by sun and wind. The apples were misshapen, spotted with the honest bruises of real fruit. He offered me one with a smile missing several teeth, and I declined with a nod. My brother would have bought the lot, not out of kindness, but to prove he could. The garage smelled of damp cement and oil. My car waited in a dim corner, where light from the street filtered in weakly. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, the copies of the deed crinkling faintly as I shifted. The idea of confronting him directly hovered in front of me, tempting and dangerous. He was clever enough to twist any accusation into an admission of my own failings. He always knew how to take the air out of a room until you doubted you had been breathing in the first place. That was when I remembered the lockbox in my study, the one our father had left me, without ceremony, tucked under a tarp in the barn loft. Inside it were letters, land surveys, and receipts that reached back to the 1920s, the paper browned and brittle, the ink faded but legible. Among them was the original deed to the property, signed by our grandfather. That piece of history was my weapon, though I had never thought of it that way before. I started the car, the engine coughing twice before settling into a steady hum. The streets leading to my house felt narrower than usual, shadows from bare-limbed trees stretching across the pavement like ribs. At a red light, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror, lines deeper, eyes sharper. Not old in the way of retreat, but old in the way of remembering too much. Back home, the lockbox was where I had left it, its metal cool under my hands. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down like a chess player, positioning the first piece. The latch opened with a small metallic sigh. The letters smelled of cedar and dust, the scent of a time before anyone imagined selling what we stood on. I ran my fingers over the deed, feeling the raised impressions from the fountain pen, the deliberate care in each letter. Our family had built fences, dug wells, and buried dogs in this soil. No contract could erase that without a fight. But as I laid the deed flat on the table, another paper slipped free. A letter in my father's hand, sealed but never sent. The sight of it pulled me into a moment I hadn't prepared for. The seal cracked easily, the paper unfolding to reveal words meant for my brother. It was a warning, couched in the polite stiffness of our father's generation, telling him in no uncertain terms that the land must never leave the family. The date was 15 years before father died. The letter trembled slightly in my grasp, though my hands were steady. My brother had known this. He had kept it from me all these years. I leaned back, the edges of the kitchen blurring. If the law was going to help me, it would do so with this letter at its core. And as the late light began to pull the day thin, I understood that my father had seen this betrayal coming long before I had. The sentence rang in the kitchen like a struck wire, moving without sound, tracing the stern cadence of a man who rarely wasted words. My father had written of drought years and tax bills, of neighbors who sold under pressure and lived to regret the cash. He reminded my brother that land is not a prize but a burden willingly shouldered, a pact with the dead who cleared it and the children who might need it later. The line that caught and held was this: "Keep it together until you know who you are without it." That could take a lifetime, he had added, and I felt the edge of that lifetime pressing into my ribs. The copies from the clerk's office lay to my left, the original deed and father's unsent warning to my right. Between them, a sharpened pencil and a legal pad, old habits from an era when thinking required graph paper and patience. I copied numbers: escrow receipt, parcel ID, the survey reference with its slender cruelty slicing the orchard in two. Even the act of writing steadied me. I needed a clear plan, not a performance. Halfway through the parcel number, something else tugged at me, the name beneath the notary seal in the clerk's copy, a faint embossment I had skimmed past in the rush of anger. That was when I realized the notary's surname belonged to the family of men we used to bale hay with on the east side, those summers when our arms were rope-burned and our shirts turned salt-stiff by noon. The coincidence felt too tidy to be kind. I set the papers aside and stood at the sink, letting the water run until it turned cold enough to make my skin ache. The house held the sounds of its age, the soft tick of cooling ducts, the complaint of a board near the pantry, the slow settling of a winter-ready frame. I thought of my brother's voice blunted by charm when he wanted something, the way he made every argument sound reasonable until you noticed the part he left out. He would deny the letter mattered, say father was sentimental at the end, say ink doesn't bind the living. He would talk until the room forgot which truth we started with. I called the number printed next to the notary's name. No answer, only a recording smooth in a way that made me picture a blue blazer and a desk calendar with mountain photographs. I left nothing, no messages now, no trail that could be recast as impatience. Instead, I dialed the title company listed on the receipt. A woman answered in the unhurried tones of someone who files storms for a living. I gave her the reference number and said I needed to confirm an error. She confirmed a closing window, 2 weeks. Then, as if adjusting a picture on a wall, she mentioned a buyer's representative, a development firm with a name that sounded like a hymn. My brother liked that sort of name, clean, abstract, ending in partners. No mention of me, she added gently. Her words were professional, but they arrived with the sympathy of a bandage. I thanked her and set the receiver down as if it could bruise. I returned to the papers and studied the embossed circle again. The notary's given name, when spoken aloud, landed on the tongue with familiarity that was not friendly. He had driven a truck with a cracked windshield our entire sophomore year, owed my brother $50 for so long it became a family joke, and learned early how to sell certainty by standing too close. The minor twist of it turned inside me. The certification of our future had been stamped by a man already indebted to the one who wanted it sold. Cars murmured along the street as evening thickened, their headlights threading the blinds with thin, moving ladders. I laid father's letter flat again and pressed my palm over his signature, not as a benediction, but as a promise to a voice that never pleaded. The legal path was clear enough. Injunction, demand for accounting, petition to quiet title if necessary. I would go to an attorney who kept his office in a converted bungalow, a man who filed suits like farmhands stack hay, deliberate, necessary, with the sure knowledge that winter comes. I gathered the documents into a single folder, slid them into my coat, and felt the weight settle. The road between our houses was short in miles and long in history, and I had driven it too many times with jokes in my pocket to soften the landing. Tonight would not be softened. I locked the door behind me, listened to the bolt find its seat, and walked to the car through air that smelled faintly of snow, though the forecast said none. I turned the key and let the engine idle, resting my hands on the wheel until they warmed. The dashboard clock marked off a minute that seemed longer than its name. In the quiet, I understood that my father had not only predicted this moment, he had rehearsed me for it without telling me the script. I backed out, the tires crunching softly over last week's leaves, and headed toward the porch light my brother always left on as if welcome were a habit he could fake. By the time I reached his street, the light was burning, and I knew I would make him read our Father's words aloud. The bulb over his porch cast a weak amber puddle on the steps, catching motes of dust that drifted like slow snow. The siding looked more weathered than I remembered, paint curling away in strips along the edges. He had never cared for upkeep, just enough repairs to keep things standing, the same way he kept relationships upright, paint over the cracks, hope no one pressed too hard. I parked across the street, letting the engine tick as it cooled. For a moment, I sat there, the folder on the passenger seat, my fingers resting lightly on it as if it might buck and run. Through the front window, I could see him moving, slow, deliberate shapes against the light, the rise of a glass to his mouth. My father's letter was folded neatly inside, alongside the deed and copies. I would not leave without his voice wrapped around those words. Crossing the street, the air bit sharper, faint sweetness from somewhere unseen. My boots rang on his steps. When he opened the door, his face arranged itself into surprise, though his eyes didn't quite match the rest. "Well," he said, leaning on the frame. "You made good time. Didn't expect you tonight." "I'm sure you didn't," I answered. Inside, the living room carried the faint, stale scent of cigar smoke, though he never smoked himself. Guests, then. The coffee table was littered with coasters and a deck of cards mid-shuffle. He gestured toward the sofa, but I stayed standing, the folder in my hands. Halfway through whatever greeting he was trying to stitch together, I slid the letter free. "Read it," I said. My voice surprised me, not loud, but unmovable. He glanced at the paper, then at me, then back again. "Where'd you get this?" His tone was casual, too casual, like a fisherman talking about the one that got away. "From where it's been waiting. Read it." For a moment he seemed to weigh the cost of refusing, then unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the lines, and I saw the smallest tightening in his jaw. He read aloud in a steady, almost bored tone, but each word from Father's hand seemed to put a grain of sand in his throat. The major shift came when he reached the line about never letting the land leave the family. He faltered barely, then pressed on. When he finished, he set the letter down carefully, as if it might scorch the table. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. "It changes enough," I said. "The court will see it. So will your buyers." That was when his smile turned thin, dangerous. "You've always mistaken sentiment for law. Those men don't care about your relics. This is business, and you're too old to play the game." I leaned forward, letting the silence hang just long enough. Business works both ways. "The injunction will be filed in the morning." His expression shifted, a flicker of calculation, then something colder. "You'd ruin me for this?" "You already ruined yourself." The tension between us felt like it could bend the air. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock in the hall, the slow drag of time while neither of us moved. He had expected anger, maybe shouting. He wasn't prepared for stillness. I gathered the papers and slipped them back into the folder, the scrape of manila over paper loud in the quiet. He didn't follow me to the door, but I felt his gaze tracking me all the way out. The porch light still burned, but now it seemed harsher, carving shadows into the steps. As I reached the car, I knew he would not sleep easily tonight. Not because of the letter, but because I had shown him I could come to his door and leave without flinching. And somewhere in that stillness, he would start to wonder how far I was willing. Patience. I drove past sleeping storefronts and shuttered diners, the kind that kept one light on in the back as if a memory were cooking after hours. The streets held a thin frost, and each stop sign wore a silver edge. I took the turn toward the old neighborhoods where porches leaned into the sidewalk and mailboxes kept their dents like medals. The attorney's bungalow stood under a cottonwood that dropped brittle leaves onto the roof like loose change. A lamp glowed in the front room. He worked late, always had, the kind of man who believed documents could be taught to behave. He opened the door before I knocked hard, as if he'd heard my resolve from the street. Inside, the office smelled of paper and coffee that had baked on a warmer too long. Wall calendars from farm supply companies, a framed map of the county pocked with pushpins, a long oak desk with grooves where someone years ago had pressed a pen through impatience. I laid the folder down and told the story once, evenly, the way you explain a weather pattern to a pilot. He listened without interrupting, fingers steepled, eyes moving only when I mentioned the notary's familiar name. He asked for the deed, the copies, the letter in my father's hand. He read in silence while the furnace coughed to life. When he finished, he turned the letter over and traced the signature with his thumb, not touching ink, only the pressure line where the nib had bitten the paper. Halfway through drafting the affidavit for an emergency injunction, he paused and reached to a small file cabinet, the kind that squeaks on the pull like a protesting hinge. That was when he produced a thin folder stamped with my last name and an older date. 2 summers after my surgery, when the world tasted faintly of metal. He slid out a document I had never seen, a power of attorney naming my brother, notarized by the same man who once owed him $50, authority for the limited purpose of managing, conveying, or encumbering real property. Heat climbed the back of my neck, slow as a match carried between fingers. The signature was mine. More precisely, a version of mine from that dull season when painkillers smudged the edges of days. I remembered not signing that, but memory is a loose net when nights are broken into fragments. The attorney looked up at me over the rim of his glasses and said, gently, "We will challenge capacity. We will challenge notice. We will challenge motive. But we must acknowledge this exists." The room narrowed to the rectangle of the desk. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering over frozen grit. If my brother had waited for that season to move, he had not only broken our father's instruction, he had also timed my week.
"Injunction first," he said. "Then we file to void the instrument for incapacity and undue influence, and we record a lis pendens to warn any buyer who might pretend not to hear." He spoke like a man counting fence posts to the property line, one by one, steady as daylight. I signed what he placed before me with a hand that no longer trembled. Each stroke felt like removing a splinter. When we were done, he leaned back and studied the map on his wall. "Your brother will likely call before sunrise," he said. "Men who play at certainty shake the hardest when paper tells them no." I thought of the porch light, his face arranging itself into surprise, the calculation behind it like a knife tucked into a boot. We stood at the door, and the night came in on a gust that smelled of creek water and cold iron. The moon had risen, a thin plate catching on the branches. I tucked the remaining originals inside my coat, pressed them flat against my chest, and thanked the man who filed storms. He nodded once, not as comfort, but as confirmation of a course already plotted. On the drive home, the city seemed to hold its breath, streetlights blinking slow as heartbeats, a dog barking once and then reconsidering. I parked, listened to the engine tick down, and watched my porch go from dark to darker as the cottonwood's shadow moved across it. The phone sat mute on the hall table, carrying the weight of a call that had not yet decided its hour. I lay the suspect power of attorney beside my father's letter
and felt the old house settle in around the decision I had already made. I would go further than my brother imagined, and I would start before he woke. The thought had a clarity to it, the kind that comes only in the hours when the city has surrendered to its own dark. I slept briefly, though sleep felt more like a truce than a rest, and when the first strip of gray reached through the blinds, I was already dressed. The house was cold in that particular way of winter mornings in Denver, heat not yet risen, floors breathing out the night. I brewed coffee but left it untouched. Instead, I gathered the documents into a leather satchel I hadn't used since my wife's funeral. Its brass clasp clicked shut with the sound of something sealed against air. My plan wasn't simply to defend. Defense was waiting for permission. This was about striking before the ground shifted again. By the time the courthouse opened, frost had silvered every windshield along my street. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the way institutions mask their age with artificial brightness. The clerk at the civil desk recognized the attorney's name on my papers and stamped the injunction without looking up, the rhythm of her hand suggesting she had halted other such betrayals before. Halfway back to the exit, I passed the notary's office. Glass door, gold lettering, blinds tilted just enough to see movement inside. I paused. Saw him at his desk, pen in hand, posture that of a man who has long mistaken familiarity for trust. He was on the phone, laughing lightly. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. There is a particular calm in knowing exactly what you will do. I opened the door and stepped in. He looked up, the laughter halting, replaced by that quick recalculation I had seen in my brother's eyes the night before. "Morning," he said. "What can I do for you?" "You've already done it," I replied, setting the suspect power of attorney on his desk. His eyes skimmed it and then returned to me, and in that moment I watched him decide to feign ignorance. "That's just standard witnessing," he said. "You signed, I notarized. Nothing unusual." "You notarized when I couldn't stand without leaning on a wall," I said. "You notarized for a man you owed money to, and you notarized a document giving him the right to cut the ground out from under me." A flicker crossed his face, not guilt, but the small annoyance of someone caught in a lazy lie. "If you've got a problem, take it to court." "I have," I said, "and the court will want your testimony." That was when he stopped pretending to be unbothered. "I don't recall the specifics," he said, but his voice had lost the polish. "You will," I answered, turning to leave, "and you'll recall them under oath." Outside, the morning had sharpened. The air tasted like cold steel. I carried the moment with me, not as victory but as a tightening of the knot I was pulling around my brother's plans. Every person tied to his scheme would feel the cord before it snapped. Back home, the phone rang just past noon. I let it ring twice before answering. My brother's voice was steady but pitched lower, the tone he used when trying to turn command into compromise. "I hear you've been busy," he said. "Not as busy as I will be," I replied. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he continued. "You made it exactly as hard as it has to be." There was a pause, just long enough for me to imagine him weighing his next move against the risk of showing his hand. "We should talk," he said finally. "We are talking," I answered, and then I hung up. The silence afterward was its own kind of statement. I returned to the satchel, checked the documents again, and made copies to store separately. The sound of the copier spitting each sheet into the tray felt like an act of multiplication, not just of paper, but of the certainty that he could not erase what was now recorded in more than one place. As the afternoon light tilted through the windows, I knew this was no longer a matter of stopping a sale. It was about ensuring that no hand, brothers or strangers, could touch the land without first feeling the weight of my father's words pressing down. And before the week was out, I would make certain that weight was felt in here to the state capitol. The promise tasted like old copper on my tongue, and the morning air seemed to carry it ahead of me, sliding under doors before I reached them. At the assessor's counter, I laid the injunction down and watched the clerk's eyes flick to the seal, then to my face, then back to the page, as if measuring whether the paper could hold the history I was asking it to hold. She stamped receipt slips with the sober rhythm of a chapel bell, slid copies into file jackets, and pointed me toward the recorder's window, where a row of 3-hole punches gleamed like small machinery for discipline. The building had the same varnished hush I remembered from childhood field trips, marble attempting grandeur, fluorescent lights undoing it. By 10 o'clock, my name and the case number were threaded through indexes that had not been touched in years. I walked the 2 blocks to the title company under a sky that threatened snow and delivered the news with the clean edge of a blade. Any transfer would now have to step around the court's shadow. The receptionist wore a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She took the stamped copy and slid it into a folder. Her nails clicked once on the desk, the smallest drumbeat of nerves. Halfway through her practiced assurances, she leaned in, just enough to put a crack in the performance. "You should know," she said, voice lowered. The buyer's representative called at 8, asking if any obstacles had appeared. The word she chose hung between us like a draft no one admitted to feeling. I thanked her and stepped back into the brittle cold. Cars moved past with the muted sound of wheels over crusted frost. A bus exhaled at the corner and gathered itself again. I stood beside a newspaper box and thought about the word obstacle, how men who knock fences call posts by another name. My father had not believed in obstacles. He believed in weather and in the men who worked through it or didn't. At the recorder's window, a second clerk checked my forms with the neatness of someone who kept birds in the evening. "This will flag the parcel," she said, tapping a code into a ledger that existed both in ink and in the green glow of her screen. She handed me a receipt that felt heavier than paper and told me the file would pull itself forward whenever anyone tried to touch it. I imagined the land shivering just enough for strangers to feel a warning in their wrists. On my way out, I detoured into the archives room, a side hallway lined with map drawers and the smell of cotton gloves. A volunteer with a braided bun and an archivist's patience asked what I was looking for, and I answered in the modest language of research: historic encumbrances, old covenants, anything my grandfather or father might have sketched and never filed. She unlocked a drawer with a key on a ribbon and slid out a flat file bound with cloth. The maps were river-veined and temple-thin, then between. A field survey from 1948, and a tax plat stamped 1969. I found a folder labeled in my father's square, stubborn hand. Draft, easement, Orchard and North Field. The paper inside was careful rather than legal, but the intent was plain. Restrict subdivision, preserve the orchard against conversion, for the duration of its bearing years and beyond. He had annotated the margins with small sentences that read like prayers disguised as instructions. The minor revelations stung and steadied at once. He had planned a fence of law, not just barbed wire and habit, and, cowboy stubborn as he was, he had almost trusted paper to do what muscles could not. I traced a finger along the penciled line where he'd marked a footpath for future children, and felt something in me take its proper shape. I copied the draft and signed the log the way one signs out a witness. Outside, the day had flattened to a dull pewter, flakes starting to hesitate in the air, testing their fall. I drove to the office of a land trust 2 neighborhoods over, a brick building that used to be a feed store, and spoke briefly with a woman who knew the language of open space the way ranchers know the language of rain. She looked at my father's draft with respect rather than sentiment, then told me what would be required to make it binding. Survey description, baseline documentation, 2 signatures that meant the land would answer to something older than appetite. We stood beside a wall map pocked with pins and strings, a quiet geography of battles already fought. "Once recorded," she said, "it runs with the land." The phrase sounded like a creak under ice. I nodded and slid the copies back into my satchel, the brass clasp answering with its small, decisive click. Snow began in earnest as I stepped onto the sidewalk, soft, insistent, the kind that remakes edges into curves. The streetlights came on early, each one wearing its own halo. I could see my brother in my mind, pacing his kitchen, phone in hand, imagining pressure points that had already moved. I thought of our father's line, "Keep it together until you know who you are without it," and understood it as permission rather than warning. By dusk, I was home, the house breathing warm again, the satchel on the table like a quiet engine. I spread the papers out and organized them into the order they would need tomorrow. Injunction first, father's letter, draft easement, assessor receipts, recorder flags. Then I wrote 2 names on an index card, one for the surveyor, one for the trust, and slid it beneath the clasp. The snow ticked against the windows, patient as a metronome. I knew what I had to do next, and if I did it fast enough, he would learn that the only fences that matter are the ones a man builds on the inside before anyone else can see them. The snow hadn't stopped by morning. It lay in thin, deliberate
Daylight fully arrived, sorting the satchel's contents with the same methodical patience I'd learned mending barbed wire. Measure twice, tighten once. Leave nothing sagging. The surveyor answered my call on the 3rd ring, his voice still thick from sleep. He'd worked the county for 40 years, seen land flip hands more times than cattle at auction, and knew how to draw lines so clean no lawyer could smudge it. I told him I needed the orchard and north field marked by the week's end. He didn't ask why, just named a price and a day. That kind of man knew the less you said, the longer the truth stayed yours. By mid-morning, the snow had turned to a fine powder that blew sideways between buildings. I drove to the land trust office again, this time with the full file on the orchard easement draft. The woman from yesterday greeted me with the kind of nod people give when they've already decided to take your side. We spread the papers on a conference table scarred by decades of maps and coffee mugs. Halfway through the meeting, she paused, reading a marginal note my father had written. 2 words, barely legible. No exceptions. She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in doubt, but in respect. "This isn't just preservation," she said. "It's a declaration." I told her about the injunction, the letter, and the suspect power of attorney. She listened without the sympathy of a neighbor, but with the calculation of someone planning a long-term defense. "If we record this easement," she said, tapping the draft, "it will bind every successor in title. Your brother could sell, but no one could use the land against its terms. He'd be trading a blade for a handle." That was when the minor twist revealed itself. She pulled a folder from a drawer and slid it across to me. Inside was a copy of a deed restriction filed in 1972 by a rancher 2 counties over, a man my father had known. The wording was nearly identical to his draft. "This held up in court 3 times, she said. "The judge called it an iron post in the law. Your father borrowed language that's already been battle-tested." It was more than I'd hoped for. I left with a checklist of formalities: updated survey, trustee signatures, notarization, this time by someone with no debts to settle, and recording. Each step would thread another wire through the fence I was building inside. Back home, the phone rang again. My brother's voice carried a new weight, calm on the surface, but with that faint strain of a man steering through current. "I've been thinking," he began. "I'm sure you have. We could work this out without dragging anyone else in." "Anyone else is already in," I said. Silence followed, then the faint exhale of someone deciding not to push further. "You've changed, Will." "No," I said. "You just forgot what I learned." After I hung up, I sat at the table and went through each document again, making small pencil marks where signatures and initials would go. The house was quiet, except for the slow tick of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, children were dragging sleds down the street, their laughter sharp against the muffled world. The easement draft lay at the center of the table, weighted by my father's letter. I ran a finger along the edge of the paper,
imagining the ink sinking into the record books, permanent as the roots of the orchard itself. This wasn't just about stopping a sale anymore. It was about making sure the land stayed true to its own history, long after I was gone. By the time the light began to fade, I had the surveyor's appointment set, the trust paperwork in motion, and my brother's voice filed away with the other evidence. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained, a clean, sharp promise in the air. And as I locked the satchel for the night, I knew that every move from here would not just block him, it would make the ground itself unwelcoming to anyone who thought it could be taken. The lock's click sounded too loud in the quiet house, like a shot in an empty canyon. Snow light bled through the blinds, turning the living room a pale gray that flattened every object into its use. I left the satchel on the chair and stood at the window, watching the street wear its thin crust of ice. Some time before dawn, the wind had shifted, carrying a far smell of wet iron from the river and something faintly chemical from the rail yards. I tried to fit those scents into the days ahead. Survey stakes, signatures, a recording book opened like a hymnal and closed like a gate. The phone rang at 8, quick and sure. I answered before the second chime died. A man introduced himself with a firm voice and a name that sounded polished by meetings. He represented the development firm with the reverent title. He thought perhaps a conversation could save us all some time. He proposed a coffee shop midway between us, warm light, neutral table, 10 minutes. I agreed, because hunters don't spook game by shouting from the tree line. The shop smelled of burnt caramel and milk scalded past sweetness. He wore a wool coat with a collar that tried to look expensive and a tie that didn't quite. His handshake was dry and performative. We sat, and he took a breath, as if about to deliver mercy. "Mr. Long," he began, "these transitions can be emotional. We specialize in making them dignified." He slid a folder across the table and tapped its edge with a neatly manicured nail. Halfway through his patter, the door opened and a gust of cold leaned into the room. My son stepped in, cheeks stung red by the air, eyes scanning until they landed on mine. He froze. Then he forced a smile that remembered itself too late. The representative stood quickly, relief brightening his face. "Perfect timing," he said. Our advisor shifted under my feet, a floorboard giving way where you trusted it most. My son, my boy who had counted rings with me and laughed at the iron sugar smell of sap, set his hand on the folder as if it belonged to him. "Dad," he said softly, "let's talk about options." The developer lowered himself back into his chair like a man who had just pocketed the deed to weather. I heard my own breath thicken in my chest, slow and measured, the way it does when the doctor asks you to hold still. "Options," I repeated, and the word felt like a spoonful of grit. My son glanced at the representative, then at me. "I've been consulting," he said. "Short-term leasebacks, conservation credits, staged transfers. There's a way to make this generous." He used the word generous the way a banker uses the word neighborly. I wanted to ask him when he stopped telling me the truth and started telling me plans. I wanted to ask him when money began to sound like mercy. Instead, I asked, "How long?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "A few months," he said. "Uncle reached out when you were recovering. He was worried about the taxes." The old wound of that season flared. The dull rooms, the afternoons broken into crumbs, the signature that didn't feel like mine. Behind his words, I could hear my brother's voice, practiced and patient, explaining that a son should step in where a father left gaps. The representative tried a smile. "Your family is aligned," he said, as if reading from a pamphlet. My son didn't look at him. He looked at me with the caution of a man testing ice. "It's not betrayal," he said. "It's planning." He thought he was soothing. He was building a scaffold under the gallows. I slid the folder back across the table and let it thump softly against his knuckles.
"You've mistaken my quiet for agreement before," I said. "Don't do it again." The representative shifted in his chair. My son's face tightened, not with anger, but with something worse, conviction. We talked until the coffee cooled into bitterness neither of us drank. I said the words I had carried for days: injunction, easement, recorder flags. My son's jaw worked as if the muscles inside were learning a new word they didn't like. When I stood, the chair legs scraped the floor in a sound that made everyone turn. I put on my coat, slowly, the way a man dresses for weather he intends to walk through. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the snow had settled into a quiet that wasn't peace. My son followed me to the curb, but didn't touch my sleeve. "Dad," he said, "you can't keep land from time." I looked at him and saw my brother's posture inside his bones. "I don't keep it from time," I said. "I keep it from men who misname hunger." Then I stepped off the curb, and as my shoes bit into the packed snow, I sharpened my thoughts into clean edges. I walked past shuttered shops and the dark windows of upstairs apartments, my reflection in the glass shifting with every step. A man I recognized, but hadn't seen in years. The betrayal no longer sat in a single house on my brother's street. It now lived in the space between my son's words and his eyes, in the smooth rehearsals of men who thought dignity was just another line item. By the time I reached my car, the decision had already settled in my bones. The easement wasn't enough anymore. I would need to seal the land against every possible breach, not just his. The orchard and the north field were no longer just ground. They were the last unbroken sentence in a language my father had spoken without knowing it would need a translation. The drive back to my house felt longer than it was, each red light a pause to rehearse the next move. At home, I set the satchel on the table and spread its contents out in a deliberate sequence. Injunction first, easement draft, surveyor's agreement, the letter from my father. Then I opened a fresh legal pad and began listing every entity that might have an interest in what we held. Utility companies, zoning boards, conservation councils, each one would get notice. Each one would understand that this land was spoken for. Halfway through my list, I paused. My son had said, short-term leasebacks, as if the phrase were a quilt he could wrap around a wolf. It told me there was already a structure in place, something drawn up in a quiet room where my absence was assumed. If my brother had given him access, then the documents might already be filed, waiting for me to be too late. I called the attorney, his voice quick to answer, even in the late afternoon. He told me to meet him at his office in an hour. The snow had stopped, leaving the streets wet and reflective, doubling every light. Inside the bungalow, the air smelled of old coffee again, but there was a charge to it now, like the moment before rain. I laid out what had happened at the cafe. The major twist came when he turned to his computer and pulled up the recorder's online index. There it was, an unsigned draft deed filed electronically 3 weeks ago by a preparer under my brother's name. The grantee was a holding company with my son listed as managing member. It wasn't a sale yet, but it was the frame of one. They were setting the table, the attorney said. You just arrived before the plates. I leaned back, feeling the weight of that knowledge press between my shoulder blades. My brother had used my son as both shield and blade, giving him just enough authority to make the betrayal look like a collaboration. It was clever in the way only family treachery can be, designed to cut and cauterize in the same motion. The attorney began drafting a supplemental claim, citing conflict of interest and fraudulent conveyance. We can freeze this, he said, but we have to move. Tonight. By morning they could sign and submit. His printer started spitting pages into the tray, each sheet landing with the finality of a hammer strike. By the time I left, I carried a stack of fresh filings that would wedge themselves between my family's plans and the county's ability to recognize them. The streets were slick now, reflecting my headlights back at me in long streaks. At home, I signed where the sticky notes told me to, each stroke cutting a narrow trench through their intentions. The house seemed to breathe differently when I finished, as if it too had been holding something in.
I placed the new filings in the satchel, locking it again with that sharp, metallic certainty. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the slow creep of frost reclaim the glass, and waited for the first phone call of the morning, knowing whose voice it would be and how it would sound when he realized what I'd done. The phone rang at 6:21, a punctual fury. I let it bite once, then lifted the receiver. My brother's breathing reached me before his words, a steady rasp like someone smoothing wood with the wrong grit. He didn't shout, he didn't ask. "Undo it," he said, each syllable clipped as if he were cutting wire. I told him what the filings meant in the language of the courthouse: stays, notices, clouds on title. He called it theater. I called it weather, and the kind that lasts. He shifted tactics the way a card sharp adjusts grip. "You'll leave him with nothing," he said, and the him was my son. "You think you're saving a field, you're burning a bridge." I let the accusations settle, then answered with the only sentence that felt right. "Bridges worth keeping don't light so easily." He hung up without a goodbye, which in our family was a kind of confession. Silence folded over the house again. I set the receiver down and held it there, palm resting on cool plastic as if measuring a pulse. The sky outside was still the color of paper before ink. I brewed coffee for the warmth of the ritual and left the first cup steaming on the counter, untouched. The satchel waited on the chair like a well-trained dog, heavy with paper that could make a man sweat in January. At 8, the attorney called. "They tried to file a corrective deed at opening bell," he said. "Recorder bounced it against the lis pendens." I could hear the satisfaction he didn't let into his voice. He told me to come by to sign a supplemental declaration, more wire on the fence, more weight on the posts. I went, gloved and hatted, against a wind that found its way through wool as if it had a key. Halfway there, I stopped at the edge of a vacant lot where ryegrass pushed through dirty snow. Years ago, our father had walked us through a pasture after a wildfire and told us to watch for the first green blade. "That's the land's testimony," he'd said. Standing at the curb now, I could hear that sentence as if he'd tucked it into my coat. The memory didn't weaken me, it pulled me into the work. At the bungalow, the attorney slid a stack across the desk and tapped where my pen should go. He worked like a man baling hay against a thunderhead, efficient, unsentimental, aware of the sky. While he typed, the phone on his desk rang twice and went quiet, as if someone were testing whether we'd picked up our end of the rope. He looked up only once. "They'll come at you through him," he said. "Expect it." By noon, the notary called. His voice was dry as a weed stalk, pride vacuumed clean by fear. "I remembered something," he said, and the remembered sounded rehearsed, but the tremor under it did not. He told me the date on the power of attorney hadn't been the day we signed. It had been moved forward by a week to skirt a waiting period that the bank required for certain instruments signed under medication. He said he didn't notice at first, then did, then told himself it was a clerical correction. "It wasn't," he finished, a quiet admission that carried more weight than apology ever could. The minor turn of that detail clicked into place like a bolt sliding home. The attorney would call it corroboration. I called it a seam I could put my fingers into and pull. I thanked the notary without offering absolution, and wrote down his words verbatim on a pad that already carried the marks of this fight. Home again, I set the notary's admission beside my father's letter, and watched the two pieces of paper angle inward, as if drawn by the same gravity. The house held its winter sounds, the tick of the baseboard heat, the soft restlessness of timbers remembering warmer months. I reached for the satchel and paused, fingers hovering over the clasp. The next move wouldn't be paper. It would be the orchard itself. I drove out toward the land as the daylight thinned to a pale coin. The road wore ruts of freeze and thaw, and the cottonwoods along the drainage stood like ribs against the sky. I parked at the gate and walked in, boots nibbling through crusted snow. The trees were bare silhouettes, their limbs netted with old twine from past harvests. I stopped where the survey line had cut through on the map and looked for it in the dirt, in the air, in the logic of the place. There was no line except the one ink drew. I stood there long enough to let my breath make a small weather of its own. When I turned back toward the truck, I knew the shape of what had to be done, and it would not be gentle. The orchard was quiet in that way land gets when it's listening, branches creaking only when the wind insisted, the snow whispering against itself under my boots. I walked the perimeter, measuring not just the ground but the time it would take to move each part of this plan forward. My father's draft easement had spoken of the orchard as a single impossible to ignore. Back at the truck, I pulled an old canvas tarp from behind the seat and wrapped it around the stack of cedar posts I'd brought from the barn. They smelled faintly of the summer they'd been cut, sun and resin trapped under the grain. I carried them to the south edge, where the map's proposed survey line would have severed the orchard from the north field, and drove the first post deep into the frozen ground with a rhythm that made my shoulders remember their younger years. Halfway through setting the third post, a car slowed on the road beyond the gate. I knew the make before I saw the color, my son's sedan, idling in the cold like it had something to say. He stepped out, wearing gloves that didn't match and a scarf he'd had since college. His eyes went to the posts first, then to the hammer in my hand. "Dad," he began, "this isn't how, it's exactly how," I said, driving the post flush with the earth. The sound of each strike was an argument that didn't need words. He walked closer, boots crunching in the snow. "You're making this harder for everyone. The offer isn't worth the paper it's printed on," I said, cutting him off. "Not compared to what's buried here." I didn't mean the orchard roots, though he might have thought I did. I meant the kind of ground you stand on when you know your own name. For a moment, he just stood there, watching me set another post. "You think you're protecting something," he said, "but you're just making sure no one else can use it." "That's the point," I answered. The midpoint hook came when he pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced down, thumb flicking across the screen. His face tightened. "Uncle says you're being unreasonable," he told me. But the way he said it made it sound like a line handed to him 5 minutes ago. I set the hammer down and wiped my gloves on my coat. "Tell him he should have planted something worth keeping if he wanted it to grow without me." My son's mouth opened as if to argue, but he closed it again. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't negotiation, it was reinforcement. I finished the row of posts, each one a small monument, and strung a single line of wire between them. Not enough to stop a man, but enough to show where the orchard's breath ended. As the sun slid lower, the wire caught its light, flashing thin gold along the line. When I turned back toward the truck, my son was leaning against the fender, watching me with an expression I couldn't read, half calculation, half something softer. "You're not going to stop," he said. "No," I replied, "and neither is the land." He didn't follow me when I loaded the tools and drove back toward town. The road was empty except for my started keeping names, times, actions, all in a tight, steady script. The attorney would call it evidence. I called it insurance. I placed the notebook in the satchel alongside the filings, the easement draft, and my father's letter. The brass clasp closed with the sound of something final. And as night came down, I knew the next step wouldn't be about paper or posts. It would be about forcing my brother to stand on the land itself and see what he was trying to cut away. The thought kept its edge until morning, bright as frost on wire, and I used it like a blade to open the day.
I called him at 8 and told him to meet me at the north gate. No lawyer, no folders, no voices to carry things away from the dirt that named them. The sky was a clean, cold blue that made distance look honest. I parked by the ditch road and walked in, the snow creaking, the cottonwoods lifting their black fingers against the light. He arrived late, in his heavy coat, shoulders squared, as if a posture could hold ground. He didn't offer a greeting. He looked at the line of cedar posts I'd set and smiled like a man seeing obstacles he meant to price. "We'll walk," I said. "You can tell me where you'd put the fence you've been drawing in other people's rooms." He clicked his tongue softly. "You don't want my opinion. I want your truth while your shoes are in our mud." We took the orchard road to the irrigation gate, the place where spring melt makes the boards talk and summer turns water into something you can taste in the air. Our father taught us there, kneeling with a hand on the headgate, ear tilted, saying, "Listen for the voice under the noise." Today the ditch ran thin and dark, winter slow, but the wheel still bore the marks of our hands from other years. Halfway along the bank, I saw it, the midline shift I'd been waiting to feel. Fresh scrape marks around the padlock, the kind a new key makes, and on the post, a stapled notice from the ditch company, weathered only by a day or two. Transfer pending, shareholder authorization to be verified. The name on the line wasn't mine. He kept walking 3 paces ahead, as if he could outpace the paper nailed to the wood. "Don't make a sermon of this," he said without turning. "Water moves. That's the point of it." "Not without a hand to turn it," I answered, and the words tasted like river stones. He stopped at the headgate and looked back at me, eyes hard and bright, the way a crow looks at a shiny thing it plans to take. "You'll keep the dirt and the trees," he said evenly. "I'll keep what makes them worth anything. We both win by losing our favorite illusions." His breath smoked and vanished. "Land without water is memory, Will. You like memory." The ground tipped under the sentence, and for a moment I felt the old, younger panic, a boy realizing his brother had already pocketed the coin from the mantle and shaped an explanation for it. Then it passed. Because I had learned to check my own pockets, I opened the satchel I'd brought, not for the injunction, not for the easement draft, but for the long, narrow envelope I had never needed until now. Inside lay the stock certificates our father received for ditch shares in 1956 and 1977, cloth-like paper that had outlasted storms, signed over in neat blue ink to me on a July afternoon, the year of the big drought. On the back of the older one, his note in square hand, "Assignment effective on need, witnessed in the barn by a man who knew the weight of water better than law." I held them where he had to look. "You can't transfer what you don't own," I said. "The ditch company knows the man on the back of these signatures. He taught half of them to stack sandbags." His face didn't fall. It narrowed, calculation moving like a shadow behind glass. "You hid that," he said. "He gave it," I answered, "after you took the night turn 3 times in a row and left the lower pasture cracked like an old plate. He called that an experiment. He called this an insurance policy." For the first time since he stepped from his car, he looked past me into the orchard, as if measuring the cost of hearing our father speak from paper. The wind pressed a dry leaf along the snow's crust until it snagged on a twig. "You think you can starve a deal by choking the ditch?" he said softly. "I don't intend to choke anything," I said. "I intend to dedicate." I touched the certificates with a finger, felt the raised ink. "There's an in-stream flow before spring if I sign, and a conservation covenant that follows the water where it runs, not where men point. Once recorded, it runs with the land." He laughed once without humor. "You'd give it away rather than let me sell?" "I'd return it to the river our father listened to. The land will keep fruiting on what falls from the sky, and what doesn't will rest. Your buyers can pave memory, but they can't irrigate a picture." We stood in the cold until our hands ached through the gloves. The ditch made its winter noise, thin and persistent, a wire humming somewhere beneath. He looked at the notices, at the certificates, at the line of cedar posts he had pretended were nothing more than a stubborn old man's art project.
Somewhere inside him, a hand reached for a different map and came up empty. "I'll fight it," he said. "You already started," I answered. "Now hear me finish." And as the wind shifted and the cottonwoods whispered, I told him exactly what I would sign and where I would file, leaving him to decide whether he would follow me to the courthouse or wait for the river to tell him the rest. The words hung in the cold air between us, not loud but heavy, like a closing gate. My brother's eyes flickered, not in fear but in the quick recalculation of a man used to getting the last word. The ditch's winter flow whispered past. Bus, a sound too small for the stakes it carried. I told him about the conservation covenant in precise detail, how the shares would be dedicated to in-stream flow before spring runoff, how the orchard and north field would be bound in perpetuity to the water that had fed them for generations. "The land and the water stay married," I said, "and no one, no buyer, no broker can grant them a divorce." He smirked, but it was the kind of smirk men use to hide a bruise. "You're shackling it," he said. "I'm unshackling it from you," I replied. We stood there a long time, the sun edging toward noon, shadows shortening over snow. The silence wasn't truce, it was measurement. I could see him weighing angles, court challenges, pressure through my son, the possibility of waiting me out. But the certificates in my pocket and the papers in the satchel at my feet had already narrowed his options to a hallway with one locked door. Halfway back to the gate, I stopped and turned. "One more thing," I said. "You file anything else under my name, I'll pull every deed, every transaction you've touched in the last 10 years, and I'll walk them down to the district attorney myself." That broke the posture. His shoulders sagged, not much, but enough to show the fight had shifted. "You drag your own family into that?" "You're the one who keeps mistaking family for cover," I said. The mid-hook came when his expression changed. Something crossed it that I hadn't seen since we were boys. Not guilt, not even shame. Just recognition that I had stopped playing the same game. He looked away toward the orchard, and for a moment I thought he might say something worth hearing. Instead, he walked to his car without a word, tires spinning briefly on the icy track before catching. I stayed by the gate long after his taillights disappeared. The cold worked its way through my coat, into my ribs, but I welcomed it. It kept the edges sharp. Then I drove straight to the attorney's bungalow, the cedar posts and the certificates still on the seat beside me. Inside, I laid out the plan in full. File the conservation covenant within the week, sign over the water shares to the state for in-stream protection, and record the easement draft my father had left. The attorney listened without interruption, only nodding when I mentioned my brother's attempt at a water transfer. "That's the death blow," he said. "Once it's recorded, there's no financial incentive for him or any buyer to push. You've made the land more valuable for staying as it is than for what they could build on it." By late afternoon, we had the paperwork in order. I signed slowly, each stroke deliberate, as if the pen were cutting a channel in stone. When the last page was done, the attorney gathered the stack and tapped it straight. "This," he said, "is the kind of fence no one climbs." I left his office under a sky the color of raw wool, the first flakes of a new storm beginning to fall. The streets glistened with the thin layer of ice that comes before a real freeze. Back home, I placed the satchel on the kitchen table and left it open, papers fanned like a spread hand in a winning game. Night came early, pressing against the windows. I didn't light the lamps right away. The dark felt earned, like the quiet after a long harvest. And yet, as I sat there, I couldn't ignore the thought that my brother wasn't finished, not entirely. If I'd learned anything in 77 years, it was that men who believe the world owes them something will scratch at a locked door until their nails are gone, which meant I had one final move to make before the season turned. The house held its breath while I wrote it out in my neatest hand. Convey the land itself to the trust, keep a life estate, and leave my name only as a caretaker who would someday be replaced by wind and fruit. Morning came with a sky the color of tin. I carried the satchel to the old feed store office where the land trust kept its maps and its quiet. The woman met me at the door with the solemn nod of someone who has learned to hear resolve in footsteps. We spread the papers on a scarred table, and I signed the deed of gift, the conservation covenant, and the assignment of water shares in the order a river would recognize: source, channel, mouth. Each signature felt like setting a stone in a current. The sound in the room changed with the last stroke, as if the air had been waiting to be told where to go. We walked the documents down to the recorder. The clerk took them with both hands, as you take a newborn or a delicate instrument, stamped the first page, and reached for the next. The seal bit the paper with a satisfying press. When she handed me the receipt, it didn't feel like paper. It felt like weight, redistributed to where it had always meant to rest. Halfway back to the door, my son stepped from a bench along the hallway, coat unbuttoned, eyes uncertain. He had a folder tucked under his arm, his, not the developer's, and he looked like a man who had just decided which name to answer to. "Dad," he said, "I filed a notice with the firm. I won't represent anything tied to the parcel." He swallowed. "And I sent the ditch company a letter withdrawing from the transfer request. It wasn't mine to make." The words landed between us like a plank laid across cold water. We stood there with the hum of fluorescent lights pressing down. He didn't ask forgiveness. I didn't offer it. We were both too old for vows that break at the first thaw. "Come walk with me," I said, and he nodded. Relief and dread living side by side on his face like neighbors who keep their fences high. Back at the bungalow, the attorney had arranged a settlement conference in the plainest room he could find. 2 chairs that wobbled, a table that had been sanded original shape. My brother arrived late, his expression iron flat. The attorney laid out the facts without drama: the recorded easement, the dedicated water, the deed of gift to a public trust, the lis pendens that would now sit like a stone on any attempt to move paper around it. Then he slid forward the last document, a stipulation agreement with damages for costs, fees, and losses caused by attempts to convey without authority. "Sign," he said, "and the district attorney doesn't need to hear about altered dates." My brother read, and the muscles in his jaw worked like a man chewing something that refused to soften. He looked at my son, as if a smaller breach might be easier to cross, and found nothing to step on. He signed with a bitter flourish that wounded the paper, but not the record behind it. The check he wrote had enough zeros to remind him what hunger really costs. We left him there with his pen and his posture. Outside, the wind had shifted and carried the cold cleanly, without apology. My son walked beside me in silence until we reached the truck. "It's done," he said, testing the sentence. "It's begun," I answered. "The paper's nowhere to go now. We'll have to keep reminding the people." By late afternoon, I stood again at the edge of the orchard. The cedar posts held their thin wire like a line of quiet witnesses. I pressed my palm to one, felt the cold enter my hand, and thought about the men whose names were pressed into the ledgers now. My father's, mine, the woman at the trust, the clerk with steady hands. The ditch moved in its winter voice, thin and persistent, the way truth moves when no one is grand enough to carry it. Night came on with a clean drop of temperature, the kind that makes the snow sing beneath each step. I walked the row slowly, counting the trees the way we once counted rings on a stump, and I tried to hear if the land had accepted the bargain I'd made on its behalf. And when the thaw finally came, I knew I would stand at the head gate and listen to the water name us, one by one, if it chose to speak at all.